Boston, Massachusetts General Hospital, emergency delivery room. Sarah Mitchell, 28, screamed through contractions as they rushed her to the OR. The baby was breech, umbilical cord wrapped around his neck. She needed an emergency C-section or both would die. The nurse shouted, "Dr. Anderson is the only one available." Sarah went paler than the sheets. Jake Anderson, her ex-husband who'd left her 3 years ago when he discovered he was infertile, or so he believed. The man who'd destroyed her life by marrying her best friend 2 months after their divorce. But the baby about to be born was his, conceived their last night together before he walked out. Sarah never told him, out of pride, out of revenge. Now Jake was about to save the life of the son he didn't know he had. When he entered the OR and their eyes met, the heart monitor went crazy. But what Jake did next shocked the entire hospital. Sarah Mitchell gripped the steering wheel of her Honda Civic as another contraction ripped through her like a hot blade. It was 3 in the morning, and Boston slept under a November downpour. Mass General was still 10 minutes away, but the baby seemed to have other plans. Too early, 3 weeks before term, but the pain tearing through her didn't lie. She'd planned everything meticulously to avoid exactly this situation. She was supposed to deliver at Brigham and Women's, across the city, where she was certain Jake no longer worked. She'd checked, double-checked, asked discreet questions. Jake Anderson was chief of obstetrics at Mass General, the youngest in the hospital's history, surgical genius, savior of impossible cases, and heartless bastard who'd abandoned her at the worst moment of their lives. Another contraction. Stronger. Sarah screamed and almost lost control of the car. The baby was coming. There was no time for Brigham and Women's. She had to go to Mass General and pray Jake wasn't on call. What were the odds? It was night, weekend. Surely he was sleeping in his marital bed with Emma, her former best friend turned Mrs. Anderson. She parked haphazardly in front of the ER, leaving the car with hazards flashing. She stumbled toward the entrance, one hand on her enormous belly, the other gripping the wall. A nurse saw her and ran with a wheelchair. Within seconds, she was inside, surrounded by medical staff asking questions, checking vitals, prepping her. The young resident on duty, Dr. Chen, did a quick ultrasound, and his face turned grave. The baby was breech, heartbeat irregular, signs of fetal distress. Worse, the umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck. They needed an emergency C-section immediately, or they'd lose both. Sarah felt panic rising as they rushed her to the OR. Through the pain and fear, she heard the charge nurse on the phone. "Page Dr. Anderson. He's the only one who can handle a situation this complex. He's on call." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She tried to protest, to say she wanted another doctor, anyone else, but a contraction stole her breath. The nurse interpreted her cries as pain and increased the pain medication. Sarah wanted to scream the truth, say the baby about to be born was Jake's, that he couldn't be the one to deliver him, not after everything that happened. 3 years ago, they'd been the perfect couple. Brilliant doctor him, successful architect her, married 5 years, ready to start a family. Then the tests. Jake's severe oligospermia, chance of natural conception practically zero. His depression, the failed IVF attempts, the increasingly frequent fights. And then that terrible night when Jake came home drunk saying he wasn't a real man, couldn't give her children, was setting her free to find someone better. The divorce had been quick and brutal. 2 months later, the Instagram photos, Jake and Emma together, smiling. The engagement ring. The wedding 6 months later, while Sarah tried to rebuild her life. She hadn't told anyone about the positive pregnancy test 3 weeks after Jake left. It was a medical miracle, the 1% chance that had happened just when it was too late. Pride and pain had driven her to silence. Jake had made his choice, had Emma, probably already trying for their own children. Why tell him about the miracle he'd thrown away? Sarah had decided to raise the baby alone, changed neighborhoods, avoided mutual friends, built a wall between her new life and the old one. The OR doors burst open, and Jake Anderson rushed in, still tying his sterile gown. 32 years old, tall, broad shoulders, those green eyes that once made her melt, and now just made her ache. He stopped dead when he saw who was on the operating table. Time seemed to freeze. Jake's eyes went from Sarah's face to her enormous belly, then back to her face. His jaw clenched, hands frozen mid-gesture, putting on gloves. For an infinite moment, they stared at each other. 3 years of pain, anger, and regret condensed in that look. The nurse broke the spell, shouting vital signs. The baby's heartbeat was dropping dangerously. There was no time to waste. Jake shook his head as if to clear it and transformed into the surgeon he was. Emotions vanished from his face, replaced by the absolute focus that made him the best. He approached Sarah and spoke in a professional, detached voice, as if she were a stranger. He explained the situation, the risks, what he would do. Sarah watched him through tears, part terror for the baby, part pain at Jake's indifference. She didn't know what she expected. Anger, surprise, something, but not this clinical coldness. The anesthesiologist began the emergency epidural procedure. Sarah felt her body go numb from the waist down, but her mind was hyper-alert. She watched Jake prepare the instruments with that manic precision she knew so well. The same hands that had caressed her 1,000 times were about to cut open her belly and pull out their son. Though he didn't know it, Jake began the incision with millimeter precision. Sarah could feel pressure, but not pain. She kept her eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying not to think about the absurdity of the situation. The man who'd left her because they couldn't have children was about to deliver the child he didn't know he had. The baby's heart monitor sounded an alarm. The rate had dropped below 90. Jake accelerated, his hands moving with superhuman speed and precision. Sarah heard him curse under his breath, something he never did in the OR unless the situation was truly critical. Then she heard Jake tell the nurse to prepare the neonatal resuscitation unit. Panic overwhelmed her. She tried to lift her head, but the nurse held her down. She could only watch the confused reflection in the surgical light above her, shadows moving frantically, a terrible silence, then crying, weak, shrill, but the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. Tears exploded uncontrollably. She heard Jake say, "It's a boy," in a strange, choked voice. Then silence again as the neonatal team took the baby for checks. Jake finished suturing with hands that trembled imperceptibly. He'd done thousands of C-sections, saved hundreds of babies in critical conditions, but this was different. From the moment he'd pulled out that small body and seen the face, he'd understood. The features, the nose, the dimple in the chin. He was identical to Jake's own baby photos. He finished the suture in silence, his mind racing. The dates matched. Sarah was about 37 weeks pregnant, which meant conception in February 3 years ago, 2 weeks before he left. The last night they'd made love, desperate, trying to save something already lost. But how was it possible? They'd told him he was practically sterile, that the chances were infinitesimal. Yet here it was. The miracle they'd prayed for years, arrived at the wrong time and kept hidden. Why hadn't Sarah told him? Anger, pain, and wonder mixed in an emotional cocktail that threatened to overwhelm him. The nurse brought the baby, now stabilized, wrapped in a blue blanket. She placed him in Sarah's arms, who was crying and laughing simultaneously. Jake watched them, paralyzed. Mother and son. The family he'd always dreamed of, that he'd thrown away out of pride and desperation, that existed without him. Sarah looked up and met his eyes. In that look was everything. Silent confirmation, challenge, pain, maybe still a shred of love buried under years of suffering. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but she shook her head, a meaningful glance toward the medical staff present. Not here, not now. He left the OR like an automaton. He removed gloves and gown stained with blood. Sarah's blood, his son's blood, and leaned against the corridor wall. His legs wouldn't hold him. He had a son almost 3 years old he didn't know existed. A son Sarah had raised alone while he played perfect husband with Emma. Emma, who was still desperately trying to get pregnant, undergoing increasingly invasive fertility treatments, crying every month when her period came. How could he tell her the problem wasn't his, that he already had a son with his ex-wife? He returned to the ward 2 hours later, when Sarah had been transferred to a private room. He knocked softly and entered. Sarah was breastfeeding. The baby latched on with surprising eagerness for a premature infant. The scene took his breath away. How many times had he imagined this during their marriage? How many times had they talked about this moment they thought would never come? He sat in the chair beside the bed, without speaking. Sarah continued nursing without looking at him. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. Finally, the baby detached, satisfied and sleepy. Sarah placed him in the clear bassinet beside the bed and turned to Jake. The conversation that followed was whispered, but devastating. Sarah told everything. The positive test 3 weeks after he left. The shock. The decision not to tell him.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
She spoke of anger at being abandoned just when the miracle had happened. Wounded pride seeing him with Emma so soon. Determination to raise the baby alone. Jake listened in silence, every word a stab wound. When she finished, he told his version. The depression after the infertility diagnosis, the sense of failure as a man, the alcohol he'd started using to numb the pain, the decision to leave her because he thought she deserved someone who could give her children. Emma, who'd been there, who didn't want kids, or so she said then, who seemed like the easy solution to his pain. He confessed the marriage to Emma had been a mistake from day one, that now she desperately wanted children, and he felt trapped, pretending to do treatments he knew were useless, that he'd never stopped loving Sarah, but was too proud to admit it, too cowardly to come back. Sarah looked at him with a mix of anger and pity. 3 years of separate lives, unnecessary pain, a child raised without a father, all for pride and lack of communication. Tears flowed silently down both their faces as they contemplated the waste of those years. The baby stirred in the bassinet, a small whimper. Jake stood instinctively and picked him up with the naturalness of someone who'd held hundreds of newborns, but his hands trembled. This was his son, his son. He rocked him gently, and the baby calmed immediately. Sarah watched with a broken heart. This was what they'd missed. Jake supporting her through pregnancy, feeling the first kicks, holding her hand during delivery, the first sleepless nights together, first smiles, first steps, all thrown away for stupid pride. Jake whispered the baby's name from the bracelet. Luke. Sarah had chosen Luke, like Jake's grandfather whom he'd adored. Even in this, even in anger, she'd honored their bond. Jake felt his defenses crumble completely. He sat on the bed, still cradling Luke, and for the first time in 3 years, truly cried. Jake's phone rang. Emma. It was 6 in the morning. She'd noticed he hadn't come home. Jake looked at the vibrating phone without answering. Sarah looked away, the moment of intimacy broken by reality. Jake was married, had a life, obligations. He couldn't just rewind the tape. The following days were surreal. Jake visited Sarah and Luke with medical excuses, post-operative checks that stretched into hours spent watching the baby sleep. Hospital staff began to notice. Gossip flew. The chief of obstetrics spending too much time with a patient, looking at her in a way that wasn't professional. Emma began to suspect. Questions became more insistent. Who was this patient requiring so much attention? Why was he coming home later and later? Jake navigated increasingly elaborate lies, hating himself for the deception, but unable to stay away from his son. On the 3rd day, while Jake held Luke and Sarah slept, Emma entered the room without knocking. She'd bribed a nurse to find out where he was. The scene she saw paralyzed her. Her husband, tenderly cradling a newborn, looking at him the way he'd never looked at her. The confrontation was devastating in its quietness. Emma understood everything in an instant. The baby's resemblance to Jake was undeniable. The dates, Jake's strange behavior, everything made sense. She sat heavily in the chair, her face a mask of pain and anger. Sarah woke to the tension in the room, palpable. The two women looked at each other, former best friends now bound in an impossible triangle. Emma spoke first, voice cold as ice. She asked how long Jake had known, if he'd always known, if their entire marriage had been a lie. Jake confessed he'd only found out during delivery. Emma laughed bitterly. 3 years trying to get pregnant, fertility treatments, nights crying, and he already had a son. A son with the woman he'd sworn he no longer loved. The cruelty of fate was almost poetic. Emma stood with wounded dignity. She looked Jake in the eyes and simply said she'd call the lawyer. Then she turned to Sarah, and for a moment, pain overcame anger. She whispered that maybe, deep down, they'd always known Jake had never really been hers. She left without looking back. Jake remained petrified, Luke still in his arms. In a few days, he'd gained a son and lost a wife. But looking at Luke's small face, so similar to his own, he knew there had never really been a choice. From the moment he'd seen his son, the die was cast. Sarah watched him with mixed feelings. Part of her rejoiced seeing Emma exit the scene, part felt guilty for the pain caused, but mostly she was terrified. What did this all mean? Did Jake want to be a father? Did they want to be a family? Or was it too late, too much accumulated pain to start over? 6 months later, life had taken a new and unexpected shape. Jake and Emma's divorce had been quick and relatively civil. Emma took the house and half the savings, but refused alimony. She said she wanted a clean break, to start over elsewhere, maybe abroad. The last thing she'd said to Jake was she hoped he'd find with Sarah what he'd never had with her. Real love, not a backup plan. Jake had gotten an apartment near Sarah's. They didn't live together. Not yet. They were slowly rebuilding, brick by brick, a relationship destroyed by pride and misunderstandings. But every day Jake was there, for Luke's bath, feeding, sleepless nights when the baby had colic. Seeing Jake as a father was a revelation for Sarah. He was devoted, present, patient in a way he'd never been during their marriage. Maybe losing everything had taught him the value of what he had. Or maybe Luke had simply melted the armor they'd both built. One evening, while Luke slept, they found themselves on the couch looking at photos Sarah had taken during pregnancy and the first months. Jake browsed hungrily, trying to recover lost moments. He stopped at a photo of Sarah at 7 months, radiant despite being alone. He asked forgiveness for the 100th time for not being there. Sarah took his hand, the first time she'd voluntarily touched him since he'd returned. She told him the past couldn't be changed, but the future was still to be written. That Luke deserved to have both parents, not necessarily together, but present. That maybe, with time, they could find a new form of family. Jake confessed he still loved her, had never stopped, that every day with Emma had been self-inflicted punishment for failing as a husband. Sarah admitted she'd never stopped loving him either, that every man she'd met had been measured against Jake and found wanting. They kissed, the first kiss in 3 years, tentative and sweet. It wasn't the passionate kiss of old, but something new, more mature, tempered by pain and growth. Luke chose that moment to wake crying, and they both laughed at their son's perfect timing. A year after the dramatic delivery, they remarried. A simple ceremony at City Hall. Just them, Luke, and both sets of parents as witnesses. None of the ostentation of the first wedding, just the promise to do better this time, to communicate, to not let pride destroy their family again. During the toast, Jake raised his glass to Sarah and said, "Sometimes miracles come in unexpected ways. That the son they thought they couldn't have had arrived just when it seemed impossible. That their love had survived betrayal and pain. That they'd gotten a second chance, when many don't even get one." Sarah added that Luke was the bridge that had brought them back together, the miracle they didn't know they deserved. That fate had strange ways of fixing things, even if the path was twisted and painful. That sometimes you have to lose yourself completely to truly find yourself. The last scene friends and family remember from that day: Jake and Sarah leaving City Hall, 18-month-old Luke walking between them holding a hand each, laughing as he tried to jump. A family that shouldn't exist, born from a medical error, survived pride and separation, reborn in an emergency delivery room. The specialist who'd diagnosed Jake's infertility asked to see the results. It was indeed a medical textbook case: severe oligospermia with natural conception, probability under 1%. But as Jake said in an interview with a medical journal, life always finds a way. Luke is proof that miracles exist, that science doesn't always have the last word, that love can overcome even biological impossibility. And Sarah, in her blog that had gone viral with the story, wrote, "I gave birth to my son with my ex-husband as the doctor, the man who'd left me because we couldn't have children. The irony was cruel, but fate had a plan. Sometimes the most twisted roads lead exactly where we needed to go. Luke isn't just our son. He's living proof that love always finds its way, even when it seems impossible." Their story became legend at Mass General. Nurses told it to desperate patients. Doctors cited it as an example that medicine isn't just science, but also unexplainable miracles. And every year, on the anniversary of that dramatic night, Jake and Sarah returned with Luke to thank the staff who'd witnessed the greatest miracle, a family that had lost and found itself at the most improbable moment. Luke grew surrounded by love, unaware of the drama of his birth. To him, Dad was simply the doctor who fixed mommies and babies. Mom was the architect who built beautiful houses, and they were simply his family. He didn't know he was a medical miracle, a bridge between broken hearts, proof that fate has plans we mortals cannot understand. And maybe that was better. Because in the end, as Jake said holding Sarah's hand while watching Luke play, it doesn't matter how we got here. All that matters is we're here, together, finally, complete. Hit like if you believe true love always finds its way, even through pain. Comment with the moment that touched your heart most. Share with someone who needs to know miracles happen when you least expect them. Subscribe for more stories that prove destiny has bigger plans than ours.